Text: evaluating nearshore communities in Lower Cook Inlet, Alaska. A woman strolls into a log cabin in a snowy forest. Steam curls out of a pipe out front.
We all use fuel, oil, or natural gas. We're making a decision to put the environment at risk for some of these activities, and some of the activities have quite significant risks.
In time-lapse, cars pull in and out of a Shell gas station at night. Now, an offshore drilling rig juts up from blue water with mountains stretching across the horizon. A gas flare billows in the wind.
In order to support a healthy economy, you have to look at the trade-offs of oil and gas development, energy development. But while you're factoring those difficult decisions in sometimes, I think really knowing what the unique and fragile biodiverse habitats are important.
Seagulls flock in the water beside a boat, and waves wash against a rocky shoreline. A close-up shows yellow growth on some rocks.
We want to know and be able to inform decision makers what's sensitive and important to try and protect and preserve in this area.
A black bird sits on a hillside overlooking water and mountains. Kathy Kuhn, Chief of Environmental Studies, Alaska Region Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, wears a yellow windbreaker as she interviews on a shoreline.
Back in 2014, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management works on 5-year plans that implement a president's energy policy, and they were going to consider doing oil and gas leasing in the federal waters of Cook Inlet. And so we were starting to gather information on the biological and physical environment.
Researchers examine grids of soil and make notes. Susan Sope, Director of Science and Research, Cook Inlet Regional Citizens Advisory Council, interviews along the shore at the foot of steep mountains.
The reason that BOEM was interested in funding this study was because it's adjacent to an offshore federal lease sale area, and that sale took place in 2017. And so we're trying to collect environmental data in an area that's potentially at risk for activities associated with that federal lease sale.
A Google Earth view zooms in on the Cook Inlet and marks Kamishak Bay and Nordike Island.
Part of being a regulator for a natural resource is doing NEPA work, National Environmental Policy Act environmental assessments. And part of that is to describe the environment.
The researcher strolls along the muddy landscape, making observations. Mandy Lindberg, Fisheries Research Biologist, National Marine Fisheries Service, interviews.
We really want to document this and have a baseline, what is normally here, and understand how this ecosystem works, how it responds to variability and changes, and if there was a spill or something like that, we'd be able to make the right decisions and how we can restore some of the habitat.
On a boat, a man steers and points out something on the mountainous shoreline. On land, the group spreads out and sets up their gear on the murky ground.
Well, we're doing some baseline studies over the intertidal areas and these habitats on this side of Kamishak Bay. We are putting out transects.
So we lay out a measuring tape, which is our transect line, and then we divide it up and section it out by each habitat, the upper zone, the middle zone, and then the lower zone.
It's a transect from mean high water to as low as we can go, and we divide it up into blocks, and within those blocks we do a random number of quadrats depending on the length of that section.
Square frames with strings running across in grids sit on the ground as the researchers take samples. In a rocky area, they examine white growth on boulders.
And then we have random points that we want to sample along on both sides. But we want it to be random in nature. We don't want it just to be along the transect tape, so we utilize tent stakes to set our random spots.
Researchers lean over the water as they take data from one of their test points.
It's a highly technical piece of equipment we use in the field. It's a tent stake, and their biggest advantage is that they're neon colors, and so you can see them.
So you have a line on your data sheet that says, we're going to do a sample at 20 meters. So you'll get your tent stake and you'll stand up to the tape line at 20 meters and you'll toss it back. And then once we get the tent stake on the ground in that random spot, then we put the quadrant down.
A researcher tosses the neon green stake over their shoulder. It bounces across the ground. Then they head over to it and lay down the square frame.
And that allows us to do the measuring of the species on the ground.
You have your camera back? I've been demoted.
At a number of random spots, the researchers take turns flinging their neon tent stakes over their shoulders.
Action shot.
Susan and Mandy sword fight with the tent stakes. Kathy holds a mechanical pencil in her mouth as she chucks her stake over the rocky ground. Mandy.
The kind of labor-intensive version is we put the quadrats down and we have a grid on that quadrat with 25 points, and we identify everything under that point all the way down to the substrate, including what the substrate is.
Pseudotrix on Thamylus.
Susan scratches at the rock with her mechanical pencil as another researcher jots notes.
On rock, Pseudotrix on Thamylus on rock.
And, you know, that's a lot of data. It takes a long time to do those, but that's kind of the traditional way you do it. You get overstory the things that you see on the surface and the things underneath. We also then do a much faster version that's just a photo quad.
So we photograph everything, and then back in the winter, people can go back and count all the different species of kelps and algae and critters that live there.
Researchers label the quadrants and snap photos with a digital camera.
And what that does is just really captures what's on the surface. And if there's understory, we don't get that detail, but maybe we don't need that kind of detail if it's just a rapid assessment. So that would be cheaper, faster. You could do more quads, have more confidence in your statistics if you're seeing change. So yeah, those we're doing both together so that we can compare and see what are the differences between the two methods.
Rock. Next, Cathalmus dali, CD rock.
Mandy leans over a quadrant and lists off her findings to Kathy.
Next, Cathalmus dali, CD rock. Next.
When I first started on this project, it was some assumptions like, oh, we're going to see these things, and was really surprised. You know, you never know till you go and look, and it was very different.
A researcher stands on the other end of a tape measure on a narrow peninsula as Susan and Mandy sort through papers.
These areas that are included in our study are these very, very flat or very low angle rock ramps or rock reefs that go on for hundreds and hundreds of meters. And so the zonation patterns are very different here than what we see in most of the other areas of Alaska that we study.
The researchers travel to different areas and get new data sets.
Like, wait a minute, where did we just come to? This is not what I was expecting. There's a lot of head scratching initially, so it took some time to figure it out. This place has so much stuff going on. It's so dynamic in the winter. It has freezing, it has ice scour. It's being disturbed all the time, and then in the spring, there's a lot of runoff in Cook Inlet and turbidity, and there's not a lot of photosynthesis ability. The water has zero visibility in some places, and so it's a really stressful environment for most marine life.
Bits of ice float on dark blue water. Then a waterfall cascades over rocks. Murky water flows past rocks. Algae covers rocks in another area as researchers take notes.
Some of these areas are incredibly lush. There's, you know, just lots of green, red algae and kelps, and it's just very beautiful. But what surprised me is that it's not that friendly for intertidal invertebrates. We're just not seeing a lot, and I don't know, but it's very dominated by the algae, and there's not a whole lot of grazing that seems to be going on a lot of the sites that we visit.
Very different types of morphologies of different species of the seaweeds, the invertebrates. Taxonomically, they're difficult to tell exactly what they are. They're very different than across Cook Inlet and Katchmack Bay. A few are the same, but really different species communities and morphologies of those species on the beach that was very intriguing to me.
Park Service workers set up tripods with monitoring devices. They eye monitors and punch things into the keypads.
Park Service had some methods that they could help us out by applying these very, very high resolution vertical height measurements. What we're able to obtain is very high resolution positioning, in horizontal space, but also vertically. And so for every place that we sample all the invertebrates and algae that occur in the intertidal zone, we're going to be able to attach a very precise tidal height.
Time-lapse footage shows the tide slowly creeping up over the rocks as the researchers make their way inland.
And so across these big flat ramps of habitat, it looks like they're flat, but they're actually changing very, very gradually. But by having this really high resolution vertical tidal height, we'll be able to understand better how those slight shifts in maybe rising sea level or anything that changes that might shift the pattern and the zonation along there.
Water flows past aquatic plant life. A crab-like creature scuttles along.
The coastal ecosystem, the nearshore, there's a lot of productivity there. There's a lot of sensitive habitat for early stage marine life. It's nursery areas sometimes. And so all these different marine species are kind of concentrated along the shoreline.
A green-tailed creature sneaks under algae. Waves lap against the shore as birds bob in the water.
So there's a lot of activity that happens in the nearshore. It's extremely productive. The amount of biomass that's produced in some of these habitats with all the different macroalgae. A lot of commercial fish species and important forage fish species use the nearshore environment for hiding out, for feeding, and it's just a really important area biologically for certain life stages of a lot of different species.
Fish drift through clear water. A fishing boat sails past a snowy, pine-covered mountain. An oil rig sticks up from ice floes.
Yeah, there's changing pressures in this area. There's active commercial fisheries, and there is some potential industrial activities with oil and gas. And then there's also some potential mining activity that is on the horizon as well. And then there's the natural variability in the environment, situations with climate change that might impact the structure of the food web that would have ramifications up towards those commercial fisheries or some of the marine mammals.
Waves roll toward shore. Pools of oil leave iridescent spots on the water around a ship. A crew works to clean a shoreline and contain the spill.
So one of the concerns is that if you do have spilled oil, the nearshore environment is where things start to get contained. Your depths shallow up, so if you have any kind of energy, your chance of mixing oil down to the benthic environment increases, and if it gets close enough to shore, it's going to strand, and it can soak into some types of sediment for many years or decades, depending on the type of habitat that you have.
When you start talking about these ecosystems and their productivity and making them sustainable so they'll be around and we can still use those resources, you got to understand the ecosystem and how that productivity contributes to that process. And it's a huge part of Alaska's economy. Lots of people rely on fishing and harvesting for all of this, and if it goes away, there's going to be a lot of stress on people and the economy, and want to know how can we fix things or manage this so it doesn't happen again. And probably the biggest lessons learned, like the Exxon Valdez oil spill, and how we cannot let that happen again, where we lose resources and they just never come back.
Birds cluster on the blue water. A cruise ship docks beside fishing boats. A fisherman hangs a fresh catch on a hook beside other fish under a sign. Caught at Seward, Alaska.
Well, I really love that there are places like this that are still pretty remote, and it takes a lot of effort to get out here, and you can still see a lot of wildlife. You don't see a lot of human activity.
Otters twist through the sea, and dolphin fins cut through the water's surface. Sea lions lounge on the shore. Researchers gather on a windy day as a boat arrives to pick them up.
Well, some of these spots are not even accessible by skiffs. It's very hazardous, these ramps and rocks. Lots of huge currents, Cook Inlet, big tides, big winds. So it's a lot more challenging just getting to these sites. And that's, a big part of why no one's looked at it before. But, that old saying in Alaska, the last frontier. In some of these situations, these are truly some of the last frontiers when it comes to understanding nearshore ecosystems.
Mandy sits with the researcher as they document a sample area. Video production by National Park Service. Logos: National Park Service, NOAA Fisheries, Cook Inlet Regional Citizens Advisory Council, and BOEM, Bureau of Ocean Energy Management.